The first thing that ever happened was I just felt absolutely out of my element creepy when we moved into that house. I was given my own bedroom, and I remember lying in bed, and I remember watching an elderly man come up the stairs and onto the landing area, and he stood there for a moment and just looked around and then walked over, thankfully, into my brother's bedroom.
Welcome to the Rental Property Owner and Real Estate Investor Podcast, brought to you by the Rental Property Owner Association, providing benefits and services to real estate investors and rental property owners for over 48 years. With your host, Brian Hamrick from Hamrick Investment Group.
This episode is sponsored by Green Property Management, managing everything from single-family homes to apartment complexes in the West Michigan area. Find out more at greenpropertymgt.com.
For most of my life, I lived a very fun, carefree childhood. We loved telling ghost stories, especially about haunted places in Michigan. In our childhood, we used to ask our parents to take us to some of these allegedly haunted public places, the restaurants, the museums. We lived near Ann Arbor, Michigan. Right around the summer of 2000, I would have been in college. My brother would have been in high school. He started hearing strange noises in the house. He would leave the family room, which had two lazy boy recliners with the footrests. He would walk into the downstairs bathroom, alone in the house, and he would start to hear the footrest on the recliners going up and down, up and down, up and down by themselves. Shortly following that, my parents would also have very tame experiences in the house. A flash in the corner of their eye, doing a double take, thinking that someone was walking by. It was always by the front door was a hot spot. Loud knocking sounds, really drastic temperature changes. My mom walked into an upstairs bathroom and just to turn on the light switch, and the temperature was so hot in the bathroom, so blazing hot, that she, jumped and screamed and recoiled. For many years, they owned a second home. It was a cottage on a lake, and they decided to build onto the cottage and turn that into their retirement home. So this is what I find interesting involving any kind of remodeling. My brother was over visiting, and he could hear what he thought was our dad working in his office. And our dad sounded really irritated. It sounded like he was in the middle of a work project that was not going well. My brother could hear really loud, disgusted sighs a couple of times. And then he could hear paper crumbling. Like if I took a piece of notebook paper and just very loudly crumbled it up into balls. And so my brother kind of called over to my dad, like, "What are you working on? Gosh, that sounds a little crazy in there." Silence. "Dad, what are you doing?" Silence. He walks into the office space. No one's there. Right around that time, my brother's wife, my sister-in-law, saw what she thought was my mom walking from the kitchen onto their all seasons room. My sister-in-law could see what she thought was my mom in her nightgown and her bathrobe. She called to my mom. Again, nothing, no sound. And her heart's kind of racing. Like, why isn't she answering? What was that? She had enough courage to kind of peek into the kitchen and this all seasons room. No one was there. My mom was taking a bubble bath at the time.
That's Melissa. She's a professional musician and music professor. She's also a paranormal research assistant. We'll be hearing more from her in a moment. I want to welcome you to the Rental Property Owner and Real Estate Investor Podcast Special Halloween Edition. We did something similar 3 years ago, episode 94, and it was one of my favorite episodes. Today, we're bringing you all new stories about haunted houses, apparitions, paranormal experiences, and the roommates who don't pay rent and can't be evicted. I recorded so much great material that I had to break this up into 2 separate episodes. In part 1, you're going to meet a group of paranormal researchers and the retired Reverend who has brought them together. In part 2, which will go live on Thursday, you'll get to accompany me to a real live haunted house in Bay City, Michigan. I want to warn you that some of their stories may frighten you, and some may even terrify you. Aside from the sound effects I've added in, everything you're about to hear is the actual professed experiences of the people involved. But let's get back to Melissa, because she's about to introduce us to someone who's been experiencing paranormal activities since he was a child.
When Jerry's first book came out, it was a total game changer. And then when the subsequent books came out, they were so detailed, they were so well written. And it was through these books and my family and friends' experiences that I reached out to Jerry. And now the rest is history. Now I'm part of this team. Never thought this would be happening. And here we go.
I'm Reverend Gerald Hunter. I'm an ordained United Methodist minister, recently retired after 30 years of service. And I also am an author of 3 books on haunted places in Michigan and currently working on my 4th book on haunted places in Michigan. I have been all over the state at least 300 or 400 different places, private homes, businesses, municipalities, doing investigations for people.
As you're about to learn, what happened to Reverend Hunter during his childhood has made him the perfect person to understand and research paranormal activity.
I was raised in a very haunted house in Brooklyn, Michigan. It was an old farmhouse. My father moved us there in 1965 when I was 11 years old. The first thing that ever happened was I just felt absolutely out of my element creepy when we moved into that house. I was given my own bedroom, and I remember lying in bed. I would keep my bedroom door open, and I remember watching an elderly man come up the stairs and onto the landing area, and he stood there for a moment and just looked around and then walked over, thankfully, into my brother's bedroom. The house was heated with coal and wood furnace in a Michigan dirt floor basement. And it was creepy going down there. But what was even creepier was once a week we would rotate which one of us boys had to go down and get the ashes out of the furnace and bring them up and dump them and bring the ash can back down into the basement. And it reached a point where we wouldn't go down alone. We'd go down in pairs because we would hear children crying down there. We would see an old man wandering around. We finally went to my mother and told her what was going on. And she's from the deep south. She's from Alabama. And in her polite little southern drawl, she listened to us, and then she said, "Now, boys, they're not going to hurt you." And I remember thinking, oh my God, Mom sees these too. Although the crying of the children in the basement was continual. And it made me wonder, why would there be children crying in the basement? To this day, I wonder, why are children down in a dirt floor Michigan basement crying? There are some paranormal experiences where you'll see someone, but it's more like watching something on television, a rerun on television. For instance, there were times we could go step into our living room, and there would be an old woman sitting in a chair, and she was knitting or doing something. And she was absolutely oblivious to us. And then she would fade away. And every time we saw her, she was in the same place doing the same thing, and she was oblivious of us. Some people call that a place memory. It's just the energy that's there. And so therefore, it just keeps reappearing for some reason. And then there are those that interact with you, like walking into the kitchen when you're getting up for breakfast to go to school, and there's a man standing there by the pantry in clothing that looks like it's from the 1920s, and he just turns and looks at you and smiles and walks away and turns into the pantry itself, and he's gone. Or you're brushing your teeth in the bathroom, and you rinse your mouth and you look back up into the mirror, and there's another face next to yours. There were actually times we played little games with the spirits in the house. I can remember being with my brother and shouting out in the living room, "Show us you're here." And every light and every piece of electrical equipment, TV, recorders, whatever, would start flashing on and off, not together, but intermittently. It was like a light show. And then you would holler, knock it off, and it would stop. And you'd yell, do it again, and it would do it again. Those until my mother made us stop doing that. She knew they were there. She was just not certain it was a good idea to play with them. I can remember my brother and I had some friends over. They wanted to have a euchre party up in the large bedroom upstairs. This was in high school. And one of the girlfriends of my brother stood up to take a break and was just watching people play and listening to the music. And she looked up at the dresser across the room that had a big mirror. And she saw that in the mirror, there was a man standing next to her. And she let out a scream in the middle. It was middle of winter, and down she went and outdoors and wouldn't come back in the house. We had to take her home. We found out it was not a good way to entertain girls you were trying to impress, but the guys enjoyed coming over. Tracy and I were married in 1996, and I thought, I'm going to bring her over to my mom's house. My dad had passed away by then. I did not tell her about the house. We sat at the kitchen table with my mother, and then my brother and his wife, who were living with my mother. We looked up because we could see the handle, the door handle on the door that goes up to the bedrooms start to turn. And then the door swung slowly all the way open, and then it was lifted up off the old-time hinges that were on there. It came off the doorway, and it laid itself horizontal in midair and went across the room and laid itself down. And then what went through my mind was, I probably should have told my wife about the house, because she just stood there and watched this. But she walked into the kitchen, and she looked at me and says, that was great. Tracy, when we got married, had 2 little boys. One was 5 years old, and we came over for another visit. And my brother's 5-year-old son was there as well. And the 2 of them went upstairs to play. And about 10 minutes later, her son came down and just stood right tight up against her. And she kept saying, why don't you go back up and play? Go back up and play. And finally he said, no, there's a man in his room. And he stands behind one of the chairs and he just watches us. He's wearing blue jeans and a white T-shirt, and he just watches us. So when my mother, she sold the house, I think it was in 2013, to a young couple in Ann Arbor. And I said, Mom, did you tell them about the house, the hauntings? And she said, well, no, I didn't want to frighten them. Well, about a week later, they called my mother and said, you left some dishes in the dishwasher. Can you come over and pick them up? So I drove my mother over there. It was in the evening. We went in and we sat at the table with them, and we were having tea and coffee, and they had some cookies out there and just conversation about things and how much we loved living in the house. And I could tell they were a little nervous, that they were a little apprehensive about wanting to say something. We finally got up to leave, and very quickly the woman of the house, the young woman, just blurted out, before you go, can you tell us who died in the bathroom and who all those people are upstairs? I remember my dad, he loved the house dearly. My mother always wanted to move because the house was just so old, and he never did. He always said, I want to die there. And from the description of the spirit that the people from Ann Arbor who bought the house from my mother, the description they had of what they saw upstairs and what Tracy's son saw upstairs, they encountered my dad. So I think he's still there.
I'd like to take a moment to tell you about Green Property Management. Not only do they manage everything from single-family homes to apartment complexes in the West Michigan area, they also manage my entire portfolio. So I can tell you from personal experience that their unique flat-fee management style is worth a closer look. If you feel that your property isn't operating to its fullest potential, then Green Property Management can help you take a holistic approach that will save you money, eliminate your headaches, and increase your net income. And if you're a property manager interested in applying Green Property Management's model, give them a call at 1-866-95-GREEN or visit them on the web at greenpropertymgt.com. Because of his unique background, Jerry is invited to many haunted places in Michigan, but he always brings others with him so that they too can bear witness.
My name is Mandy, and I am a professional classical pianist, and I'm a research assistant for Jerry as well. We were at the music hall, the old music hall in Heartland, Michigan. Another team member and I went down to the basement, and I think this place used to be a nursery probably, or a dressing room. I mean, there were mirrors, and there was a rocking chair and a changing table and little kids' seats. This other team member and I, we situated ourselves in the back of the room with the doors open, just looking out at the stairs in the hallway. And we just kept asking questions for about, I'd say 10 minutes. We probably were just sitting there asking questions, to see if we heard anything, but nothing. Completely quiet. And I felt something, I just had a creepy feeling, which I never ever get. I've never had this before. So I'm sitting there and I'm just like, creepy feeling, but I didn't say anything. And our other team member looked at me and she's like, "Are you okay?" She goes, "We can leave if you're scared." And she's never asked me that before. I'm like, I don't know. I just feel something. And I heard something behind me, as if somebody had sat down in the little kid's seat right behind me. She's like, "Was that you?" I'm like, "That wasn't me." I'm completely still. And all of a sudden, the light turns on, that motion detector light, really quickly. And we looked at each other, and we both felt our bodies go numb. We looked at each other at the exact same time, so it wasn't the power of suggestion or anything. We looked at each other at the exact same time, and I felt completely numb on the left side of my body. She felt numb, and the light just started going on. She started asking questions. "Are you so-and-so? Are you happy that we're here? Do you wish we would leave?" Try to make that light go on, and it just kept going on and off, on and off. And I'm looking the whole time at this door, the hallway, the stairway that we had just come down. And I'm thinking, first of all, I should have said this before. The whole time that we're looking, so this is, 15 minutes, I'm seeing this large garbage bag, black plastic bag in the stairwell. And I'm thinking in my head, it wasn't scary to me because I was like, oh, it's just a black plastic bag. But I'm thinking, how did we not trip over that? Because I don't remember having to jump over it. We are so frightened just because of what we're both feeling at the same time, that she goes, "I don't know." She goes, "Let's just go back upstairs because it's scaring us, So we turn the lights on, got all our stuff together. We go up the stairs, and the black plastic bag is not there anymore. So what was it? I don't know. It was some type of shadow, I think. Yeah,
was that exciting to you to have your first?
Yes, it was exciting, a little scary, but
She was visibly shaken.
I was,
they both were.
And I'm telling you, I just am not. I'm never spooked. So
Well, I think the place is definitely haunted. Too many people have had experiences there, and the black thing on the stairs is not unusual. Entities often appear to people as black shapes. Even if there's very little or no light, they seem to be darker than the darkness you're in. They'll be there for a while, they'll move, sometimes they take the shape of a person, and then sometimes they're just gone. And talking about the black forms, there's a house in Dearborn Heights that's in one of my books that encountered the black forms that would actually come down from the ceiling and hold the teenage girls down on the bed where they couldn't move, they couldn't breathe. I went to that house and spent a lot of time with the people there, and things happening to them that would absolutely terrify them. Crucifixes on the walls being turned upside down, covers pulled off of them. They were genuinely terrified. And I talked to one of their boyfriends who was over one night, and he and one of the daughters was watching television, and she went into the kitchen to get something, and before she came back, he said, "This four-legged form of a man with long arms and long legs just came crawling across very quickly like a spider in front of the television set, stopped and glanced at him, and then just kept on and disappeared out of sight." And he left then, and he refused to go back in the house. As a matter of fact, he wouldn't come to the house for me to talk to him. I had to go elsewhere. And then we encountered something similar to that with a house in Wayne, Michigan, where a good friend of mine from the church, he was in his 80s at the time, but his granddaughter was living with him. They were having all sorts of paranormal things happen, the usual activity, doors and things like that, and sounds and sights. just he and I were in the house, and we were talking, and we went into the back bedroom. It was a bright, sunny day with all the curtains opened and everything. No clouds in the sky at all. Nice, hot summer day. And as he was telling me some of the things he was experiencing, that room, and just that room, you could look out the window and see the brightness, but the whole room went black. And if you looked out of that room, the rest of the house was not black. And it was very oppressive. And all he said to me was that this happens quite often, and I don't understand why. He wasn't frightened. He was a survivor of the Japanese death camps during World War II, so very little frightened him anymore. So I brought another person in with me, and we went through the house, 4 or 5 hours just walking around the house, and we discovered hidden under a couple of blankets that were stretched out on the floor. I thought maybe they were just sitting on these blankets playing cards or something. That's what they were using them for. But we moved the blankets off, and they had a pentagram on the floor. And then we found black candles, and then we found some occult things that they were doing. And finally we confronted the granddaughter, and she said, yeah, she was into trying to connect with demon spirits, she said. And her grandfather told her, well, you've connected. It's time you moved out. We actually, when we were doing our investigation, did see a very black shadow person go up the basement stairs and into the kitchen. The black forms, I think, are simply the energy of the people trying to manifest themselves, and that's how they manifest themselves. I've only seen black forms a couple of times. The times when I was growing up and even now that I've experienced apparition, they've been full body, just as solid and colorful as you are and as I am.
Many of the places that Reverend Hunter has visited are well-known and documented sites for paranormal activities. We're going to take a tour now of some of the more notorious locations that he's investigated.
The Henderson Castle in Kalamazoo, which is a bed and breakfast. It is a magnificent edifice built in a castle style in the 1800s. My wife was with me one night when we were investigating, and we all rented separate rooms. Besides our group, there was just one other couple that had rented a room, and they were on the same floor as us. And so, lo and behold, when my wife and I went to go to our room in the evening, our door is right next to their door, and we could hear them talking in there, so we figured we're going to be in and out of here, our room, a lot. We have to remember to be very, very quiet going in and out. We don't want to disturb them. And throughout the night, whenever we'd go to our room, we could hear them talking, so we'd be really careful and very nervous about disturbing their experience, that they just want to enjoy a night there. In the morning, I went down to pay the bill, and I said, I hope we didn't disturb the people in the room next to us. And she said, there were no people in the room next to you. And I insisted, and my wife insisted, yes, there were at least 4 or 5 times going in and out of there. We would stand there unlocking the door as quietly as possible because we could hear them talking in there. And she said, no, they are across on the other side of the building in another room. And I said, how do you explain this? And she was totally not bothered by any of this. She just said, well, you're not the first people that have told us about things in this room. There's a house in Ohio, in Worcester, Ohio. It's an old farmhouse built in 1828, and it overlooks a beautiful valley just south of Worcester. In the early 1900s, there was a man there who farmed the area, but he also owned a business, some kind of a harness business or something. He was not a nice man, according to records, but he left to go, this is early 1900s, he left to go to, I believe it was New York City, on business, an extended business trip for the better part of a year. And when he came back after like 11 months or so, his wife greeted him with a newborn baby girl. There's no way it could have been his. He's gone for 11 months and the child's a few weeks old. As we went through newspaper reports, we discovered that not long after he returned, there had been an accident at the house. The mother had tripped and the baby had fallen down the stairs and died. We also found an article that a few months after that the woman committed suicide by jumping out the upstairs window. And our take on that was he probably killed the baby and killed the wife. And he's still in the house. And he's a very nasty man. And when I say his ghost, is still in the house and still active in the house, when they see him, it's just like looking at you or me. And he's dressed in black pants, he wears a black coat and a white shirt, and he has a red beard. And whenever he shows up, they know he's there to begin with. If he's behind them or something where they don't see him, they can tell he's there because he smells from sweat. They had a birthday party for their children in the basement one time, and I guess he showed up at that party and frightened the kids so badly that all of them wanted to go home. He shows up in their doorways of their bedrooms and taunts them, smirks at them, blocks the doorway if they want to leave the room, stands there and then disappears. He would grab Flo and her daughter when they were in the shower. That really frightened them badly. He would walk in the bedrooms and just stand there and stare at people. They gave us the house for the whole day and night, and we took pictures of all the rooms, especially upstairs where a lot of the activity was. As we finished the last room and were walking back down the hallway to go downstairs, we had to pass by the master bedroom, and we just froze. Every picture was now slanted. The drawers of the dresser were pulled out, and the coverings of the bed were now piled up on the floor. John said, he came to me and he said, I've got to use the bathroom. And I said, well, okay, that's fine. Go ahead. And he said, no, I've got to use the bathroom. And I said, okay, what do you want from me? He said, I want you to go up with me. And I said, John, go ahead and take care of what you got to take care of in there, but I'm not going into the bathroom with you. I'm going to stand here and I'm going to wait for you to come out. And he said, okay. So he finished his business. He washed his hands and he dried his hands on that towel, put it back on the rack. He's walking out and the towel came flying past him. I saw it. He saw it. Freaked him out a little. He went over and he set it down and he balanced it perfectly. And he turned around and walked out again and it came out again. When men get frightened, when they get really frightened, they don't do the screaming, running thing. They try to cover it with anger. And he got ticked. And he's a big guy, a graduate of the Naval Academy. And he went back in that room and he grabbed the towel and he knotted it on that thing. And he said, throw it at us now. And he walked out and it came running back out again. We went back again, only this time I went there with my nephew, who's a police officer. We were there for the night again, but the couple decided they're going to stay with us, and they invited another woman over, a good friend of theirs, and they decided they're going to work the Ouija board. The husband, John, went upstairs and sat in an area on the stairs where he could look down the long hallway. They were working the Ouija board in the living room, and my nephew and I were sitting on the floor watching them do the Ouija board. 3 times during that session of theirs, they both gave out a cry and jerked away from the board, and because they felt something at the same time. The last time it happened, they jerked away from it, their hands up in the air, and the planchette continued to move across the board by itself and off onto the floor. And David, my nephew, nudged me, and he said, Uncle Jer, look. And coming out of the kitchen and into the living room was this white, fluffy, cloud-like thing about 2 feet off the ground, and it moved out of there and into the living room behind the women and then over to us and around us. When we put our hand in it, it was icy cold. Well, that's when the women got up and they called John back from upstairs. And they said, John, we're getting all kinds of activity. His answer was, no kidding. I've been sitting up here watching a woman in a long green gown walking back and forth up and down on the hallway crying. When that night was over and all that had happened, my nephew and I were leaving. We were led to the door about 4 a.m, and they were thanking us for coming. And I just on a whim turned back around and just hollered, good night, George. And immediately there was a loud pounding on the living room wall. And the owner of the house, John, looked at me and very calmly just said, George says good night.
There's a place in Detroit, an old military fort, that's well known for being haunted. And this time, what Reverend Hunter experienced, he was able to record on audio tape.
It was originally built in 1848 as Fort Wayne. Today it's called the Historic Fort Wayne, and it was built as an Army barracks on the Detroit River, very near downtown Detroit, within sight of the Ambassador Bridge. And it was also used in World War II as a prisoner of war camp, mainly for Italian prisoners of war. It was on, I think, our third visit that we were going to spend an overnight there. Two of us were in the barracks building, second floor, all the way far west as you could get into a large room. We pointed our cameras and our recorders toward the hallway that left that room and went the length of the barracks building on the second floor. Off to the right and left as you walked past would be the barracks rooms where the soldiers would stay for the night. So we had set up in such a way we could catch whatever might happen down that hallway. Well, we were both sitting in beach chairs watching that ambient light and watching the hallway. And all of a sudden, we heard a whole bunch of footsteps in the distance, way down the hallway, getting louder, coming toward us. And we just perked up. And we're both listening intently, and they're getting louder, and they're coming closer. And then you hear muffled voices. And then you hear almost what sounds like somebody giving an order. I couldn't make out what they said, even when I played under headphones. And then one voice rose above the others and said, "Closing the door." And the footsteps got a little closer, and then it just stopped. You don't see anything on that video camera, and you don't hear anything on that video camera. But we heard it on our little tape recorder.
There's no doubt when you listen to that clip that you can clearly hear someone saying, "Close the door." Listen carefully one more time. Sometimes Reverend Hunter's investigations bring him in contact with something much more sinister than your typical paranormal experience.
This was probably our third overnight visit to the South Lion Hotel in South Lion, Michigan. It has purportedly been haunted for a long, long time. Waiters and waitresses and cook staff and bartenders have all had things happen to them, seeing full-body apparitions, objects being moved, chairs being pushed across the floor, the usual potpourri of paranormal things going on. But to the point to where a lot of the women especially were getting very frightened by some of the things that were happening, saying they'd been touched, they'd been grabbed. And we had heard about a young woman who came from Mexico with her husband. She was starting to have all kinds of experiences that frightened her to the point to where she quit. She said that she would come in and she would spend some time with us there, but only if she would be no further away than 4 or 5 feet from the rest of us at any given moment. She was that frightened. She even claimed that the spirit had followed her home at one point, and she had encountered it in the ladies' room. She had encountered it all through the hotel. Well, anyway, we're doing our investigation, and we're doing a walkthrough of the premises, and as we walk through different areas, she's telling us what she has experienced in those particular areas. She's very frightened as we're doing this. She didn't want to be the last person walking down a hallway. She didn't want to be the first. She wanted to be in the middle because she felt safer. And her fear was palpable. Well, about halfway through our walkthrough, we were going down the short corridor that leads from the dining room toward the kitchen, going pretty much single file. She started to just nervously cry out, "He's here, he's behind me, he's here." And she was terrified. And we stopped for a moment, and then she screamed out, "What do you want?" And immediately she was flung up against the wall of the walk-in cooler. And she started screaming, "My back is burning, my back is burning." So One of the women I was with and her husband lifted up her sweater she was wearing, or lifted it up to look at her back, and scratched into her back as though it was scratched with 3 nails at the same time, not just a single fingernail, but like 3. Scratched into her back was the word Y-O-U, scratched backwards into her back. Now, when you realize she was screaming, "What do you want?" and then she felt that and it burned, to have "you," Y-O-U, "I want you," scratched into her back, it took us a minute or two to tell her what it was. When we got her composed enough, we had to stand in a circle pretty much around her and escort her downstairs and out of the building. And she and her husband got in their car and went home. And she refused to ever go back there again. And in fact, because she was so terrified it would follow her home, she informed her husband she was going back to Mexico to visit her parents for a while.
So I want to go back to the farmhouse when you were young and your family moved into it. Was that your first experience with the supernatural?
No. When I was about 5 years old, we lived in Wayne, Michigan. And I remember I got very sick. And I was laying on a white vinyl living room couch in the turquoise-colored living room. It was typical 50s. My mother, to the day she passed away just last year, would tell everybody that I had a temperature of 107. My dad put an old green army blanket over me to try to sweat it out. And when they realized the temperature was going up, they panicked. He ran into the bathroom to fill it with ice and ice-cold water with the idea they were going to dunk me in that. My mother got on the phone and started to call my grandmother in another city nearby, who was a registered nurse at the time. And I remember suddenly not being on the couch anymore. I was up at the ceiling area, looking down at myself. I could see myself lying there, covered up in the blanket. I could see my dad in the bathroom doing what he needed to do to get the cold water drawn. I could see my mother on the phone, even though they were in different rooms. I could see my grandmother answering the phone over in Garden City. I could hear what they were saying. My brother ran down the street to get my uncle. I could see all of that, even though I was still up at the ceiling of the living room. And everything was like a juxtaposition of reality. And I'm watching all of this all at the same time, yet I am feeling absolutely at peace. I'm all right with what's happening. Then suddenly I'm not even in the living room anymore. I'm in what appears to be a long black tunnel. It's absolute darkness, yet you can see everything. I know that makes no sense, but like I said, it's the strangeness of opposites. I started moving toward the end of the tunnel, way far ahead, that had a light that was brighter than the sun, but it didn't hurt to look at it. I never felt so loved, so accepted, so at peace, just so absolutely okay. And I started going toward that light, which was far off, and I started passing people, adults, who I knew were relatives of mine. Even though I'm only 5 years old, I knew who they were, and they were there smiling, and it was like they were welcoming me. And then I had a voice tell me that, no, it's time to go back. You have things to do. And instantly I'm back on the couch, and I know my fever broke then, right after that experience, and I started getting better. It was really a peaceful experience because I didn't want to come back. That's how good I felt. But when I was back, of course, I was glad to be back at the same time. After about 15 years, I was visiting my mother. I never told anybody about this. I was visiting my mother, and we were looking at old photographs of the family that went back probably 80 years. And the idea was she was going to write the names of all those relatives on the back of those photographs so that future generations would know who they are. As we went through them, every now and then I'd say, "That's Uncle Albert," or "That is Aunt Margaret." And my mother would say, "How do you know who they are? They passed away decades before you were born. So I finally had to confess to her what had happened to me when I was young. I thought at the time when I was young that was normal until I started to share it with a couple of friends at school, kindergarten, first grade, second grade, and they would make fun of me and that. Then I realized it's not normal. Don't talk about it. And that's why I kept it to myself. When you get a little older, you reach a point where you have so many of these experiences that it's not important to you anymore whether people believe you or not. I know what happened. I know how it changed my life. And I knew from a very young age, from that experience, that someday I was supposed to go into ministry. I didn't want to. I fought against it. But I always knew that that's what this was all about. I try to counsel people who are dying. I don't tell them of my experience, but I try to assure them that this isn't all there is to life, that there's more ahead, and it's peaceful. It's wonderful. It's going to be all right.
Do you think that there's any correlation between your near-death experience as a child and then what you witnessed at the farmhouse?
Yeah, directly, because after that near-death experience is about a year later, when I was about 6 years old, my mother had a part-time job at a factory, and I remember one evening my mother telling my dad that her friend's daughter, who was about a year younger than me, had passed away from, I think it was leukemia. And I remember going to my mother and asking, can I go to the funeral home with you? And she said, okay. And so I went to the funeral home, and it was full of people, everybody grieving. And I remember her lying in her casket. It was a small casket. She had beautiful blonde hair and a very light blue colored, like chiffon dress on. And I could hear people talking about how grateful they were that she lived to see her puppies being born. And while they're talking and comforting one another and were tearful, I remember looking over in the corner near the casket, in the corner of the viewing room, and thinking to myself, why are they so upset? She's standing right over there watching us. And I didn't say anything to my mom about that, but I knew that everything was all right. That, yeah, that's her lying there in the casket, but she's also right over there, and she's fine. So I believe that near-death experience opened me up to have these other encounters and experiences. So it was up to me to find out the purpose of that. Because a lot of people would ask me after I started writing my books and investigating places, how can you reconcile these things happening with your religious faith? And my answer to that was, well, we believe in life after death. And they would say, yes. I said, so what is so strange about perhaps encountering life after death from time to time? There's more to who we are as physical beings. We're spiritual beings as well. And life continues on, just in another form, another way that someday I'll have the answers. I'm not in a big hurry, but someday I will.
When you saw that little girl at the funeral, were you able to communicate with her in any way?
No, I just stood and looked at her. She wasn't looking at me at all. She never looked at me. She was watching all the people that I assumed that she knew, relatives and things like that. And I wasn't even shocked. I just looked and saw her over there and looked back at the casket and looked back at her, and I knew that she was okay. That wasn't really her lying there anymore. She's over here. I've had things happen in my life, all my life, ever since I was a child. When I was regularly meditating during my ministry career, I would actually be visited in the middle of the night by people who had, from the church or the community, who had just at that time passed away. And they would appear to me in the bedroom, wake me up, and we would have a conversation mentally, not verbally, but we could communicate that way. And then when it was over, I would write down their name, the time that they appeared, what they had to say. And then the next day I would simply wait for the relatives or the funeral director to give me a call and let me know that indeed the person's gone.
So these were people who had died that night?
Yes.
And then visited you to, let you know that they had died?
They would show up, and basically what they all wanted to know was, what's happening? Am I going to be all right? I'm scared. What do I do? These kinds of things. They needed comforting. They needed a sense of understanding. Even though they had been people that had gone to church all their lives, This is the first time they experienced anything like this, of course, because it's a death. They needed to know that they were going to be all right.
How did they know to come to you?
I was their pastor, and I think that's the only reason that I can figure that they came to me, unless they're at the time that I was just psychically perhaps open to these kinds of experiences. I never told families that their loved ones came to visit me. They didn't need that kind of burden put on them emotionally. So I pretty much kept all of this to myself until I started writing the books, and especially since I retired. There's another encounter I had with a detective in the suburbs of Detroit, and she was called out to a armored car robbery that had taken place. They were robbed, and two of the guards were murdered. And she said that she was standing there and writing her report. She could see one of the guy's body underneath the vehicle where he tried to get away from the gunman but was killed. And she said she looked over at the curb and saw the same man sitting there, looking at his body under the vehicle and just saying to himself, "You idiot, you idiot. Why did you do that, you idiot?" She confided this in me. She asked that I not write about it. I'm talking about it now, but she said wait a lot of years, because I've only got a few more years before I'm retired. And so I've waited a lot of years. This is the first time I've told anybody this. These kinds of paranormal experiences are happening across the board. Places of business, a funeral home in Redford, Michigan, where an older woman who worked as a secretary there for years, she would experience the spirits of the dead walking through, but never in her office, until a young girl walked into her office during her own funeral service and stood next to her desk during the service. I think places are haunted because sometimes people are very attached to a place. Sometimes they're very attached to a person, which means wherever that person moves to, the spirit goes with them. Sometimes they're there because they have unfinished business. Sometimes they're there because they are afraid to move on. Maybe they feel like they're going to be punished or something. And I think sometimes they don't even know they're dead. And they're hanging around wondering what is going on, what's happening here. I've experienced, I believe, all of those things in all of the places that I've ever been to.
You've done a good job, Jerry, of explaining kind of what the different spirits are and why. But one of the things I wonder is when. Like, if you look at it from their perspective, are they in their time 100 years ago? Mm-hmm. Are they in our time? When are these spirits actually happening?
Yeah, watch the end of the movie The Others, and that addresses that very well. It's a really good ghost story. I think that sometimes they manifest themselves in our time and space, and I think sometimes, without knowing it even, we're in their space. Einstein, the theologian Paul Tillich, they all agreed that everything that ever has happened, everything that is happening, everything that's going to happen is happening now. That there's no such thing as time and space. Time is simply how we construct our lives and organize our lives. Tillich called it the eternal now. We keep thinking about, we're seeing somebody from 80 years ago. Wow, this place is haunted. I'm wondering if people in the 1800s are experiencing us. I talked with a woman who worked at a major university in the Midwest, and this was back in the 1980s, and she said that she left her office and went into another building in the music department. And she said when she walked in the building, she felt like everything had changed, and it felt really strange. She walked into the office that she'd been into hundreds of times to get the stuff that she needed, and it was totally different. Very older furniture. The people were dressed differently. There was a woman there dressed from a different time period. She looked out the window, and the buildings that were supposed to be there are no longer there. The trees are no longer there. The library that just had been built is no longer there. And she is experiencing something from over 100 years ago. And she said it was very eerily quiet. The people she was looking at had no knowledge of her being there. They were going about their business. She finally panicked a little bit and left, told her experience to other people. They said, that sounds like so-and-so who ran the music department, this woman. She taught here up until 1946 when she died, and she started in like 1912. And they got out the old yearbooks in that, and as they went through them, she pointed right to her and said, that's the woman. And said, that's the woman I saw. And they said, that's the woman who ran that department for those years up until 1946 when she died. She had entered their space, their time, where they were still going about their business. So it's like everything that ever happened is still happening. Do I understand that? Can I explain that? Absolutely not.
While he may not be able to understand or explain everything he's encountered, Reverend Hunter has helped many people with their hauntings. If you're experiencing your own paranormal episodes in your home, rental property, or place of business, this is your opportunity to let him know.
I'm working on my fourth book. It's tentatively titled Haunted Michigan: Confessions of a Ghost Hunter. And it's going to give advice on ghost hunting. It's going to make comments about equipment people are using. And it is going to give my opinion on things, but the bulk of it is going to be about haunted places. But I'm trying to extend it as well into places outside of Michigan. And what I'd like to do, since I'm just starting the writing and the research for it, is anybody that's listening to the podcast that has had experiences with hauntings or needs help with a haunting, whatever the case might be, I'd like to hear from them. The best way to contact me is contact my publisher, and that is Thunder Bay Press in Birch Run, Michigan. Just get on the internet and just type in Thunder Bay Press, Birch Run, Michigan. It'll take you to the website. I would like them to send letters there that they will forward to me at my address.
I hope you enjoyed this Halloween episode, but it's not over yet, because just as we were wrapping up our conversation, Reverend Hunter made me an offer I couldn't refuse.
There are other places that even we can take you to if you're interested. I'll just email you and tell you, here's where we're going. If you're interested, tag along.
I would absolutely love that. Coming this Thursday, Part 2, where you accompany me to a real-life haunted house in Bay City, Michigan, where a major rehab project has awakened the spirits of the past. And what happened that night after 2 a.m. is so strange and so bizarre that I can't wait to share it with you. I want to thank everybody for listening to this episode. I'm your host, Brian Hamrick from Hamrick Investment Group, and you can find out more about me by going to higinvestor.com. That's higinvestor.com. And you can also ask questions and join us on Facebook by going to RPOA, Rental Property Owner and Real Estate Investor Podcast. This episode was sponsored by Green Property Management, managing everything from single-family homes to apartment complexes in the West Michigan area. Find out more at greenpropertymgt.com.
You've been listening to the Rental Property Owner and Real Estate Investor Podcast, brought to you by the Rental Property Owner Association. You can find out more at rpoaonline.org. If you enjoyed this podcast, please go to iTunes to subscribe, rate, and review.